Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this panel on engaging the next generation in expanding outreach. My name is Alyssa Crowell. I am the law school programs attorney in the animal law program at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Say that 5 times fast. I've had the pleasure of working with the next generation of animal lawyers for the last 5.5 years, so I'm excited to join this panel to discuss how to reach, motivate, and empower students, young professionals, and other communities. Joining me today are Allison Troy, Director of Research at Faunalytics, Ilana Braverman, Co-founder and Chief Operating Officer at Greener by Default, Hira Jaleel, Visiting Assistant Professor at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, and Tené Johnson, an Associate at Latham and Watkins. Now I will pass it over to them to discuss how they are reaching the next wave of animal advocates and creating a wider audience through their work, starting with Allison.
Do something to my mic?
No, they should be able to turn it on.
Okay. Is that, yes, okay, yay. Do we have the clicker for me too? I'm Allison Troy. I'm the research director at Faunalytics. I'm super happy to be here with all of you today. I'm trained as a social psychologist. I worked for 10 years as an academic. Studying human emotion was my specialty, so I'm going to touch a little bit on that today. And then decided to leave the ivory tower several years ago for the very relaxing and non-stressful job of grassroots political organizing work in Pennsylvania. So I worked for 3 years doing kind of polling, message testing, public opinion kinds of research and training, and a lot of that work we thought very hard about outreach to the younger generations to inspire political action. So I did that for 3 years before joining the Faunalytics team earlier this year. So I'm going to kind of pull on each of those threads a little bit in the discussion that we have today. But most of what I'm going to be talking about today comes from a research study that we released earlier this year in collaboration with Good Growth. And so the name of this study was Exploring Gen Z's Attitudes Towards Animals and the Environment. It's available on our website, the full report. I think the full report is also available on the conference website as well. So just a little bit about that study. We surveyed about 400 members of Gen Z. These were college-educated people between the ages of 18 and 26. And we sampled from 4 different countries, the United States, China, Thailand, and Indonesia. We asked a very wide range of survey questions and open-ended questions about their attitudes and values about animal welfare and the environment, as well as their behaviors, their perceived barriers to taking action, and their interest in pursuing careers related to the environment and animal welfare. So I'm going to touch on some of our top-line findings that were true across all countries today, and some that were specific just to the US. But I think what I wanted to start with, the biggest point that I wanted to kind of emphasize, I promise I will keep my graphs to a minimum. But one of the questions that we asked in this study was we gave people 2 statements. The first was, I'm concerned about animal well-being. And the second one was, I'm concerned about the environment. And we looked at the degree to which members of Gen Z agreed with those statements. Agreement in this graph is in shades of blue. And so you can see that 93, which is really a whopping number, 93% of all participants across all 4 countries expressed some level of concern about both of these issues. And over 75% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed with these statements. And I think that this is really important in showing that the task for us in engaging young people is not to persuade them to care about these issues. In overwhelming numbers, they already do. They really do care. I think the task instead is finding ways to channel their existing attitudes and their deeply held values that they have into taking more action, kind of closing the gap between what they care about and what they do. So I'm excited to get into that more in our Q&A.
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ilana Braverman, and I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer at Greener by Default. I've been working at sort of this nexus between behavioral science, food, and climate for about 7 years now, and co-founded Greener by Default almost 3 years ago. So our mission is to empower institutions with evidence-based consulting and hands-on guidance to serve inclusive, sustainable, and most importantly, delicious plant-forward menus. Today, I'm going to be mostly talking about our work with colleges and universities, but I just wanted to mention we work with hospitals, we work with pretty much all food service venues, so corporate cafeterias, venues branching into stadiums, as well as universities and large events. So if anything here inspires you today and you want to work with an institution, let me know. We work with pretty much all of them. So the good news here when we're talking about trying to get more delicious plant-forward menus on the agenda is that, as Allison just mentioned, students expect meaningful action when it comes to climate change and healthy food. So according to Inside Higher Ed's 2022 Student Voice Survey of over 2,000 college students from 114 universities, 85% of students say that it's important for their campuses to prioritize sustainability. And more than 2/3 of Gen Zers actually expect help making those healthier food choices. So we have that groundwork laid out for us. And the opportunity here, for everybody, but really the operators at these institutions, is to benefit their triple bottom line. We can help you meet your carbon reduction goals without actually taking anything off the menu, just providing that diverse choice for your diners, improving student health and productivity, profiting, hopefully keeping costs neutral or saving money, and attracting students and faculty. So our strategy is inspired by the book Nudge. I'm sure many of you have heard of this book before, which looks at the impacts of defaults and other nudges on human behavior. So just a quick, easy example of a default. How many of you still have the ringtone that came with your phone? Raise your hand. Okay, a lot of us, at least over half. So kind of the same thing here. If you were asked to select that option at the beginning, we'd see a lot less. People would probably pick their favorites, but it's one of those things that if you don't mind too much, and then when it comes to food, which I'll talk about, that we just want to eat delicious food, not really caring whether it's plant-based or meat-based, making that default option, the plant-based option, can go a long way. So we did a study a couple of years ago with UCLA and Harvard and a few other universities where on a catering menu, we gave half of the students randomly selected a menu that said, the meat-based option is the default, and if you want a plant-based option, opt into it. And then you're gonna have the vegans and the vegetarians most likely saying, yes, I'm gonna opt myself out of that, that normal option. But when you flip the script and said, the plant-based option is the default option, let us know if you want meat, and you start to normalize that idea, well over half of students said, yeah, that's fine. As long as it tastes good, I'm okay with that. And so what I really want to focus on here is what we're going for is these flexitarian diners, which we're seeing more and more in the Gen Z population. On one side, you have the vegans and vegetarians who are going to select that plant-based option, go out of their way, ask those questions. They're going to eat that sad little hummus wrap in the little box on the side of the room. We all know we've been there. That's not the majority of the population. On the other side, you have the meat lovers who are going to be really upset about a fully vegan policy at an event, at a university, and to kind of get away from that pushback, if we just say, let's make the most options on the buffet a plant-based option, or let's sub out these ingredients in certain recipes, you're gonna get that majority here, which is really what we're going for, and is kind of exemplified here. So our top strategies, I'm not going to dig into any of them too much right now, but making the plant-based the default option. This is especially simple at a coffee bar. Just asking your local coffee bar, hey, if they're already not charging for oat milk, or if they are, removing that upcharge and making that the default option. So if someone wants dairy, they ask for it. It's just flipping the script for what we have today. Climate-friendly ratios are, in that buffet, making at least 2 of the 3 options, or 2/3 in general, plant-based, so that it's not about, do I want that one vegan thing, but do I want mushrooms, or tofu, or tempeh, or lentils, and giving that diversity of choice to the diner, so it's not about how do I identify, what am I in the mood for today. Subbing out dairy and egg product for their plant-based alternatives, placing items in the general menu at general dining hall stations instead of on their own, making sure they sound really delicious, and then overall reducing the amount of meat served in meals are kind of our top strategies. So we will work with institutions, look at their menus, explore where are the low-hanging fruits, high-impact strategies, and go from there. So just a couple of top lessons, and I'll share a quick story recently, is what we've really learned through this work is meeting people where they are is extremely important. We're not gonna get it perfectly the first time, but maybe you make one tiny change that then they're willing to implement, throughout all of the universities they have or all of the healthcare operations in their area. Internal allies are key. We cannot do any of this work if there is not somebody inside the organization who is willing to say, I want to champion this effort, I'm gonna get the right people at the table. And practicality over perfection, kind of similar here, we might not get everything we want when we propose that first plan, but maybe we start somewhere, and we're seeing this especially in universities, they've got a lot on their plates, a lot of, things, especially at the beginning of the school year, but maybe they implement one thing and they see, oh, the students still really like the food. This isn't as scary as I thought it was gonna be. Let's move on from here. So the one just really exciting example I'll share is an inspirational story. We worked a couple of years ago with New York City to implement plant-based defaults throughout all of their New York City public hospitals. And this was, the mayor was a part of this, the Sodexo was a part of this, the hospitals, we all worked together to make this happen. That went so well that they are now expanding this initiative to 400 hospitals throughout the country. Early data from one hospital shows that offering plant-based meals by default showed that since the program's implementation, patient selection of meat-based meals declined 20%. Though these numbers are preliminary, they suggest a promising potential impact. If even just 10% of the 290,000 meals Sodexo serves to patients per day from meat-based to plant-based at these hospitals, the company could transition over 10 million meals per year. So again, it's not about everything. It's these small changes that we're able to make a big impact. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Hira Jaleel. I'm a visiting assistant professor at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, where I teach farmed animal law. So I teach industrial animal agriculture law, aquatic animal law, and I lead something called the Farmed Animal Protection Project, where students work on real-world law and policy issues to make a difference for farmed animals. And I'm here to talk about what attracts students, or how can we attract more students to animal law as a field of education. And just to preface whatever I'm going to talk about today with the fact that this is all based, whatever I'm going to say is based on my own observations and just in the classroom, both online and in person, conversations I've had with students and conversations I've had with colleagues. If you're a student and you really disagree with anything I say today, please come chat to me, chat with me afterwards, and I'd love to hear from you. So on the question of how we can attract more students to animal law, I'd like to start with discussing some observations. When I first studied animal law, the main theme across most of my courses were, the seminal debate between animal welfare and animal rights. Whether establishing legal personhood for animals is the way to go, and how can we do so? And I think in the years following when I graduated from my animal law master's from Lewis and Clark, I think that there was this wave of euphoria that accompanied these personhood declarations and decisions all over the world, if not in the US. But then we kind of saw that wave subside, right? So we saw that since then, there have been fewer, for the past 2 or 3 years, there have been fewer successful cases like that globally. And even within the US, we see more deregulation in the farmed animal space, which brings a lot of students to animal law. And we haven't gotten over a lot of standing hurdles that pervade our case law. And there's also, I think, more awareness around some issues that used to be considered pretty niche in animal law, like aquaculture or insect farming. And I think students are feeling this urgency to stop the expansion of some really harmful animal use industries before they get off the ground. So in light of this, what I see in the classroom is that fewer students are asking, is this animal welfare, or is this animal rights? How do we establish personhood as kind of an abstract exercise? And they're asking, well, what can we do right now? What can we do this semester? What can we do this academic year? How can we use whatever we learn in law school to immediately make a difference for animals, which I think is a very valid question to be asking. And it was really heartening to see, and I think the conference so far has demonstrated exactly where we as where we are as a movement, and also demonstrates what students want. Because students have started to think more, and I see this, about leveraging other areas of law to make a difference for animals. So they're thinking about coalitions with other animal lawyers, or collaborating with other social justice movements. So for example, environmental law, food law, immigration law, public health, criminal justice, disability justice. And I also see students thinking more about tools. So of course, as lawyers, litigation and legislation are always going to be tools in our toolbox. But I see a lot of interest in, for example, leveraging AI to make a difference for animals. Using public records laws, my students this year especially are really interested in public records laws. Media strategy, so we had a panel on the media, and this is also something students want to be media savvy. They want to draw that bridge between the work that they're doing in courtrooms or as animal lawyers, and how to communicate the impact of that work to the general public or to the lay person. Leveraging state ballot initiatives and local government tools, I think students are pretty disheartened by, or I've noticed students get pretty disheartened by and disillusioned by the idea of the federal government stepping in to make a difference for animals, especially when we talk about farmed animals, which is, of course, my area of expertise, but also other areas of law. So I think that students are really energized by state and local government tools, and they are eager to make a difference on those levels. And so I'm happy to get into some of this more during our discussion, but I think if we really want to sustain and expand our movement, our animal law programs and the education that we provide to students have to reflect all these realities and what students are looking for. So yeah, that's my opening.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Tené Johnson. I'm an associate at Latham and Watkins. I'm based out of our New York office, and I also have the honor of serving on the board at the ALDF. A little bit of background, I want to talk a bit about my path towards animal law. I think what I really want to focus on today is sort of condensing everything that I've learned in the last 7, 8, 9 years about how to go from being a law student to an associate at a firm, especially at a large firm, and how to really develop a robust animal law pro bono practice. And I hope to give you guys every practical tip and bit of advice that I've learned along the way. By way of background, I graduated from Brown University in 2014. At the time, I was very set on becoming a veterinarian. My undergraduate degree was in biology, worked for years in vet hospitals, and around that time I actually learned about the existence of the animal law field. It was not something I'd ever considered before, or really that I knew existed. And so at that point I transitioned from wanting to become a vet to wanting to become a lawyer. Fast forward some years, I got my law degree from Columbia. I, of course, participated in our Student Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter, learned a lot, and really inserted myself at that point into the movement and into the community, which I really want to talk about more in depth later. And then I summered as an associate at Latham, and I'm still there now. I'm a mid-level associate. And so my practice area for non-pro bono work focuses mainly on complex commercial litigation. I've also done some work in securities and some work in copyright, but mainly complex commercial, so CCL. And in my time at the firm, I've been thankful, like I mentioned, to have a very robust animal law practice. Many of my clients are in the room right now, which is really exciting. So I've been able to do work for the Humane Society, for the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and for PETA. A little bit of some background, some of the assignments and cases that I've worked on. So my pro bono practice has, I would say, mainly fallen into 3 buckets. There are so many things, and I'll talk about this a bit more later. I think it's really important to keep in mind that there are so many different ways to help the movement, but these are just the things that I've really focused my time on. So number 1 has been litigation. I'm a litigation associate. That's sort of where my skill set is. For example, I just finished this year litigation for PETA, First Amendment free speech case where we filed suit in federal court against a public airport in Wyoming. PETA tried to run a pro-vegan, anti-leather ad at the airport, which was rejected. We strongly suspected viewpoint discrimination, and that led to us filing suit. I would say the second category of cases or of pro bono work that I've been able to do focuses on amicus briefs. There's always a lot of work to do there, drafting and filing these briefs. We heard a bit yesterday actually about Texas's Death Star bill, the one that preempts local laws. So for example, there the Humane Society needed help drafting and filing an amicus brief discussing all of the ways that that bill would impact puppy mills and the ability of local ordinances to pass on banning puppy mills, and so that was another really great opportunity. And then I would say the third category is sort of research or like what I call like claims analysis. I think I was really surprised when I started practice just how difficult or time-consuming it can be for an animal welfare organization to even get in touch with a pro bono attorney and really put together the assignment for them. And so I think something that can be really helpful is stepping in and saying, look, are there any things that you've been wanting to look into or you're considering filing suit or you want to have somebody just run down the strength of this case or the strength of these claims? And so that's another category I'll talk a bit more about, but basically deciding, do we have a case here? And so today, I think I'll focus mainly on the two sort of stages of my life in animal law so far, one being as a law student and all of the ways that you can work animal law into your life as a law student. And then when you become an associate, if you go the firm route and you work at a firm, how to establish your pro bono practice, the practical ways of how to get a firm to agree to let you do pro bono work, which is really such a commitment on their part. And I will just hope to tell you guys everything I know.
Great, thank you. So we're going to switch gears now. I'm going to ask a few questions that I have for you all, but I'll start with Allison. So you showed your research that young people are definitely concerned about animals and the environment, and so I'm wondering what is the best messaging to use to appeal to Gen Z to motivate them to take action, and on the flip side, is there anything you see that's preventing them from taking action?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm going to start with the barriers to action first, the flip side first, because I think that can directly inform understanding how to motivate. But in the study I described, we asked specifically about barriers, what prevents young people from taking action, and I think there's a lot of really important things there. The first thing I'll start with, though, that's going to inform a lot of my answer was one of the most striking findings of our study. So we asked people, we gave them a statement that said society is doing enough to safeguard animal well-being, and asked them how much they agreed with that. Disagreement, so not agreeing that society is doing enough, is shown in red, orange, and yellow there. And so across all of the countries we sampled in, very large numbers of people, young people, were saying that society is not doing enough. But that number was particularly pronounced. 74% of respondents in the US believe that society is not doing enough to protect animals. The numbers are similarly large when we asked about whether society is doing enough to protect the environment. And so when we delved more into data on kind of barriers and how young people view kind of issues with animal welfare and the environment, it turns out that, and again, this was true in all countries, but it was especially pronounced among Americans, that they see problems with animal welfare and the environment as systemic issues, that people who have power in our country are not doing nearly enough to address. They're really frustrated, and they see these as very serious problems. When we asked respondents to tell us what prevents you from taking action, what barriers are there, respondents in the US were most likely to name their primary barriers as corporate greed, capitalism, and political lobbying. And again, at much higher rates in the US than in other countries. And so again, they're seeing these very large problems as systemic, and that leads them as individuals to have feelings that their taking action as one person is just futile. So we had in free responses where people could type kind of how they viewed things, we had quotes, and this is a direct quote, "One person can't make a difference compared to the corporations and companies." So that was one quote, but this was a repeating theme over and over again in terms of how people responded. And I think as a consequence of those kinds of views, what we also saw was young people, again, in the United States in particular, expressing very pessimistic and very fatalistic views about the potential to actually make a difference. So we had quotes that read something like, "The earth will be destroyed for all of us and there's nothing I can do." And so, of course, not surprisingly, when this is emotionally how people are feeling, those are demotivating feelings. You are very unlikely to take action when you're feeling just kind of overwhelming despair and hopelessness. And then finally, one of the themes we saw, in addition to these kinds of kind of systemic barriers and kind of fatalism, young people tended to name financial barriers, a lack of time, inconvenience, other kind of practical and logistical constraints on their ability to take action as well. I think especially when it came, we're sampling young people. These are current college students or recent graduates. When it came to taking pro-animal or pro-environment types of actions, like changing their diet, they would say things like, "Those are behaviors that people with money can do, and that is not a behavior that's available to me." So they were naming kind of what they view as financial constraints on these types of behaviors. So if those are the barriers, then how can we kind of address those barriers in outreach to Gen Z? I have a couple of recommendations on each of those. So if we know that Gen Z really overwhelmingly identifies corporate greed and issues with capitalism here in the United States, I think we can really lean into that in our messaging to them, especially when it comes to getting them involved in advocates in animal law and environmental law, right? So we can talk about how there's work to be done on stronger legislation for the environment and animals, stricter enforcement, limits on lobbying, all the kinds of work that's already being done. I think narrating to them that that's part of the systemic change that they want would be very motivating. I think there's a lot of opportunity in emphasizing the kinds of impact that we can have when we join in collective action. I mean, I think they're not wrong, right, when they say, "What can I do to solve these problems as just one person?" And the truth is that we don't solve these problems just as one person, right? I think even in the previous panel, when we're learning about important wins in this movement, multiple times people said, "I did not do this work alone." Of course we're not. None of us are doing this work alone. And so I think narrating that real systemic change when it comes to passing legislation and making legislative reforms, regulatory reforms that comes from collective action that members of Gen Z can be part of, and narrating what that can look like for them, I think could be really powerful. And then finally, I think I love to talk about emotions, so talking about kind of emotional tone of messaging, because the amount of despair and hopelessness really is so strong, especially in younger people. And messaging research really shows that it is important to meet people where they are, as Ilana was talking about. If we just dismiss how they're feeling, the conversation is usually over, they stop listening. And so it's important, it's an important way of connecting with people to acknowledge that the way they see things and the way that they feel is incredibly reasonable and makes a lot of sense. But of course, if we end the conversation there, where it's just like, "Yep, everything sucks, I agree with you, we won't, obviously that's not super effective. And so I think it's kind of a combination of acknowledging their very real frustration and despair, but then finding a way to kind of channel that into, frankly, hopefulness, because hopefulness is the antidote to despair. And I think in messaging, one way you can do that is talking not just about what we're fighting against, but what we're fighting for, and narrating very, very clearly kind of what is the positive vision of our future if we win? What does that look like? So it's not just that we want to stop animal cruelty, right? It's that we want to create conditions in which animals are safe and healthy and thriving, maybe even happy, you know? And I think narrating that can inspire positive emotions, which are much more likely to motivate action over time than negative emotions do. So those are my brief messaging recommendations.
Thank you. And continuing on with messaging, Ilana, you talk about your work focuses on plant-based options rather than vegan or vegetarian options. What tactics do you use in naming and describing and your messaging of plant-based dishes to make them appealing to a mainstream audience? And what language do you find the most effective to avoid?
Yeah, I love this question because there's so much about the presentation of a dish that matters. And with titles, how many of us have, my favorite example is weddings. It's like sirloin steak, grilled chicken, vegan. You're like, what is it? Is it pasta? Is it eggplant? Is it mushroom? Is it lentils? I have no idea. I'm not going to pick that because I have no idea what it is. I'm not vegan, so I will not do X. That's what happens when people see vegan or meatless labels on menus. Vegan ravioli, what type of ravioli? So I can't tell you how many weddings I've been to. Sometimes the food isn't good, but when it's really good, someone goes, oh my gosh, that looks delicious. Where did you get that? I wish I would have ordered it. So how much difference can we make by just deliciously describing food? So using delicious descriptors can really help bypass those common psychological barriers of saying, I'm not going to eat this because I don't feel like I fit in that group. And so that's why we tend to say plant-based instead of vegan. When we say this is meatless pasta, you're like, okay, I know what's not in it. What actually is in it? And so when we're talking about what's not in a dish instead of what is in a dish, people are thinking about what they're missing instead of what makes this dish delicious. So some examples I have are sage and butternut squash ravioli with toasted pine nuts. Probably sounds a lot more delicious than vegan ravioli. Gochujang glazed tofu bibimbap. How is it made? What is the protein? How is it flavored? What is that eliciting in my brain of how this is going to taste? That's all really, really important for diners to feel like they're actually going to be excited about the food. It also comes back, though, to how many options there are, right? So if it's the one vegan option that's named better, that's great. But again, then if somebody doesn't like that specific food, they're going to stay away from it as well. So it's kind of how do we pair this with the other strategies? And just one other example, or one thing I also want to say is that as someone with dietary restrictions and also allergies, we're not recommending not labeling the dish as vegan. We're saying instead of vegan pasta, deliciously describe that pasta and put a little V at the end, denote whether it's vegan or vegetarian, be really specific about the way that you're labeling allergens and what the dish is in a way that those of us who need to understand what's in those dishes for a variety of reasons can understand it. But for the majority of diners, they're not seeing that dietary description as the only indicator of what is represented in the dish.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as many of us vegans know, a lot of people don't actually know what vegan is. So it's also really helpful if it had the labels. My next question, I'm going to stick with you for a second, is what trends do you see among Gen Z eating habits, and how do you incorporate that into your work?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because as I was kind of looking into it, and we see, as you were saying, Gen Z really cares about animal welfare. They care about sustainability. We're seeing this increase in flexitarianism. And at the same time, we're seeing a lot more value in comfort food and familiarity, which I don't think is a surprise to any of us in the world that we're living in today and using food as a coping mechanism in some cases. And so I think it's definitely about striking that balance, making sure that the plant-based options we're serving are not only these very healthy vegan options at the vegan station, but making sure that they're crave-worthy, that you're getting different global cuisines, and again, diversity of dishes, I can't say that enough, so that everybody feels like they have something to eat and they can also eat it plant-based. One big thing that we do in dining halls is really making sure that if you have that vegan station, that's awesome, but make sure that those dishes are also spread throughout the dining hall so that it's part of everybody's routine to experience those different proteins and flavor profiles instead of just in one specific place. The identity of vegan and vegetarian we're also seeing mean a little bit less to Gen Z in general, and so this idea of flexitarianism is really growing, and so how can we really emphasize that? How can we make sure people are feeling really encouraged to eat different dishes, but that if they're not doing it perfectly or not doing it enough, we're not pushing them away. And so that's a really important point of the work we're doing, is that we're making it the default option, or we're making it the majority, and we're making it normal, but we're never making somebody feel bad for choosing something different. And so that's a key piece of our work, to help people feel really comfortable and excited in choosing that new option. Is it a chef special? You know, having the staff really involved in like creating that dish so they're proud of it and they're excited to serve it, so that people are not like, oh, you really want that tofu dish? That actually happened in a study we did a few years ago, which is a really interesting example of like why we need everybody included in those changes, but to make sure that we're just kind of encouraging everybody to do a little bit more, and that they're seeing the impact of those changes.
Great, thank you. I always love a chef special every time. I'm going to head back over to Allison. So you talked about motivating Gen Z to care more about animals, but how do we take it that next step further to encourage more members of Gen Z to pursue careers in animal law or animal activism?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'll kind of echo some of the previous themes that I was drawing from in my previous answer here. But I think the barriers that I described are really real, but inside of those barriers are some really powerful opportunities for connection and action, I think. And so first, I think there's a real opportunity here to leverage criticism of corporate influence in a way that really will powerfully speak to members of Gen Z. If they're, and they're identifying corporate greed and issues with capitalism as primary barriers, I think this is a really incredible opportunity to frame animal law, environmental law, other forms of advocacy as a direct and very powerful tool that can be used to challenge these corporate practices and to advocate for systemic change. And I think speaking in ways like that would be really motivating for members of Gen Z. I think also, they expressed in many places a desire for things like stronger regulations, like limits on corporate lobbying. And so I think highlighting how, for example, how careers in animal law can lead to exactly those kinds of outcomes, the things that they so desperately want to see, would be really motivating as well. And then, young people were also naming very real financial and practical barriers to getting involved as advocates or pursuing careers relating to these issues. And so I think we can also kind of, wherever possible, kind of do things to describe careers in animal law or other kind of related professions as stable professional career paths that they can pursue. We can showcase competitive salaries when we can, opportunities for advancement, the stability of the legal profession. These are all things that young people highly value in career paths. And then I think, and this gets a little bit to a point that Tené was mentioning in your own background, where you kind of didn't know that animal law was really an option for a while. That seems to be very much the case for a lot of people. So in our study, we asked people to what degree would you be interested in pursuing a career relating to environmental issues or animal issues? And 25% of respondents in the US sample expressed some interest in that. That was significantly lower than all the other countries we sampled in. I still think that 25% is nothing to sneeze at. Like that's 25%, 1 in 4, that's not bad. But when people express some interest in pursuing careers, we ask them to tell us what kind of career, and they were much more likely to be able to name specific career paths relating to environmental advocacy, so things like environmental science, environmental law. When it came to animal advocacy, people were most likely to mention veterinary medicine. I also wanted to be a vet when I was younger. That tends to be, and they could also sometimes name things like companion animal rescue work, but not really much else. And so I think what's going on there is that there's an awareness issue. They're just not as aware of what the possibilities are, especially as it pertains to animal law. So I think doing things with more outreach and storytelling, honestly. So showcasing success stories like they did in the previous panel, highlighting role models that members of Gen Z can see themselves in, and really articulating this is what their job looks like. This is the kind of work they do. This is the kind of impact that they make in the work that they do. I think that would speak a lot to kind of making careers in animal law both like aspirational, but also tangible in an important way for members of Gen Z.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's why, I mean, we're so grateful for our student chapter members, because they're on campus and they're tabling and they're showing their campus communities that animal law is a real thing. And we've had students join and talk to me, and they're like, oh, I had no idea this was even a career path until I got to law school and saw an event going on, and they're bringing in speakers who are working in the field to show all the different types of things you can even do in this movement. So just a quick shout out to our student chapters for helping that as well. But I wanted to kind of get your opinion here. As a professor, what do you think draws Gen Z students to animal law?
That's a great question. I think I find two types of students in the classroom. One category of students are students who were there because they wanted to study animal law, and they came to Lewis and Clark, for example, just to study animal law. And then there's a category of students who are taking animal law classes because they have some other tangential interest. Either they're coming from an environmental law background, or they're just curious and they just want to know more about animal law. And I think that for the latter category of students, I think it's I wouldn't say it's harder, but it's more of a challenge to sustain their interest, right? So the idea then is that they're not super invested yet, and how do we get them to remain invested in animal law? And I find that for those students, some of the hesitation comes from this idea of animal welfare being a zero-sum game, or that if we're as animal lawyers looking to help animals at the expense of human beings. And I think it's really important in the classroom to clarify that that is not the case, and the fact that a lot of animal use industries also do have very detrimental impacts on human beings, right? So the presentation yesterday on Justify's work on people working in labs, I think is a really good example of the kind of work that can draw more students to animal law who obviously care about animals, but also want to see communities uplifted. I think food system reform, factory farming is another really great example of where there are such detrimental impacts of the industry on human communities and public health, and just the environment as a whole, that you can really hook students' interest, pique their interest that way, and emphasize to them that it's not just about protecting animals at the expense of other communities and human beings. I think I'm not going to be the first one talking about this, but in the past, we've probably talked about the importance of clinical courses, and I think that remains true now as much as it ever was before. Like I said, students I see, in my experience, are less interested in the abstract, philosophical underpinnings of animal law. I mean, they are obviously still interested, but they really want to see how they can implement animal law in practice, and I think experiential courses help draw that bridge between the classroom and practice. And of course, we're in experiential courses and clinics always going to teach students to draft briefs and motions and memos and the like, but I think other tools like public comments or public records requests or legal op-eds, rulemaking petitions, those are also really important tools that it's worth, every lawyer should know how, and even non-lawyers, and I'm going to talk about non-lawyers in a bit, but every student should know those tools. And students are interested in learning about them because they're quicker ways to make impact. A public comment is going to take a lot less time and resources to draft than, say, a lawsuit or a complaint, right? Also, just switching gears a little bit, there's some scholarship that's been written by some people in the room actually about the importance of incorporating animal law into core courses and increasing exposure of 1L students to animal law that way. And Professor David Favor last night talked about the need for more tenure-track animal law professors, and I think that's important for this very reason, because tenure track professors are more likely to be teaching those 1L courses and can incorporate animal law in their offerings from the get-go. So 1L students can kind of plan ahead for upper-level animal law courses. And some questions that I was thinking about as I was preparing for today were, how can we add more administrators to take us seriously? How can we expand? ALDF is, of course, doing amazing work to get animal law in every classroom or in every law school in the country. However, I still feel like in a lot of law schools, animal law is sporadically offered, not offered every semester, and it's still kind of a very niche or very optional course. And so what can we collectively do to change that reality and to make sure that it's being offered as consistently as possible? And again, really just cannot appreciate ALDF's efforts enough in that space. And I think part of that puzzle also is just more professors willing to teach animal law, more students who go on to become interested in teaching. And again, to echo Professor Favor, I think that it's really, if you're a student and you're confused about what you want to do after you graduate, don't disregard teaching as an option, because it's really important and it's really rewarding. And there's also scholarship showing that more and more non-traditional students are interested in animal law. And by non-traditional, I mean maybe students who are not lawyers, who might be interested in learning more about animal law for various reasons. And so master's programs, so veterinarians are an example, or professors from disciplines like philosophy or history who may have, what they teach might have some intersection with animal law or animal ethics. There is value in creating space in the classroom for those kinds of students as well, who are not necessarily coming to law school just to become lawyers. And programs like MSL programs or masters for non-lawyers, I think, can be really valuable tools there. And lastly, to address what might be an elephant in the room or might not, because Allison's kind of actually already touched upon this, one of the biggest stumbling blocks I see personally right now is just the lack of hardcore animal law jobs. So students are interested in studying animal law, but I think what might give them pause is are there going to be paid opportunities available to us after we graduate? And our movement has expanded and really blossomed, but we still don't have enough full-time animal law jobs for all the students who are graduating from our wonderful animal law programs. So that's another thing that is worth pondering over and thinking about a bit more. How can we as professors or administrators, or how can career services offices work to bridge that gap between what employers might be looking for and what students are studying in the classroom? How can we make students more employable? How can we position them such that we maximize their chances of actually getting a job, a full-time animal law job after law school? And also how can we grow our movement in a way that more of those jobs become available?
Great, thank you. You just essentially touched on it, but I'm wondering if there are any other things that you see on the flip side that Gen Z students are turning away from animal law, if you're just seeing that it's mostly the job outlook.
Yeah, I think the job aspect is a big part of it. A couple of other things also are that this perception that animal law is very niche and that it's just its own little silo is, of course, it's a myth that most of us know is a myth and needs to be debunked. But kind of, I have found emphasizing the fact that animal law has wide vertical applications. So there are constitutional issues that overlap with animal law, First Amendment, Fourth Amendment issues. There's federal animal law, there's state animal law, there's statutory, regulatory animal law. So just to kind of emphasize that laws affecting animals or implicating animal use are present in all parts of our legal system. And so it's not just about only doing one thing, or there's no one way to protect animals. And also horizontally, right? Because like I said, animal law intersects with constitutional law, administrative law, tort law. And so just to make that clear, that it's not something completely apart from everything else that students are studying at law school. And the last thing I wanted to also address is, again, something Allison's already touched on, which is this feeling of despondency students feel in the classroom. I have students tell me, because I teach industrial animal agriculture law, that it's the most depressing thing they've ever sat through. And that might just be on me, but it's also just the fact that, it's sad. Just what happens to animals and the way we use them is just really sad and depressing, and animal exploitation can feel really overwhelming to students, and they can sometimes think that there's just no point in even trying to address this issue through the law. And I think as professors, we have this responsibility both to temper expectations, but at the same time create hope, right? So of course, I would never claim that I will see the end of factory farming in my lifetime. I may not, but that doesn't mean that we can't make really major strides towards ending factory farming in our lifetimes, right? Yes, animal exploitation is happening at a level that it never happened at before, but also our movement is bigger than it ever was before. So people wanting to combat animal use and animal exploitation are also just more in number now than they ever were. So I think kind of just situating where we are at this moment in time against basically talking about how far we've come is, I think, really valuable and important, and helps put things into perspective for people who might just be very new to the movement.
Great, thank you. And I think, this panel definitely shows it, but even this entire conference, there's, we've all are working in the animal space, and a lot of us are in ways that you wouldn't traditionally think of when you're in law school thinking about going into animal law. So there's just so many different ways that you can get involved, including our pro bono network. So next I will go over to Tené. What practical advice do you have for law students who would like to best position themselves to do animal law pro bono work after law school?
Okay, I love talking about this. I really, really think your time in law school, for those of you who are still in law school, it's really important to think of this not as like your pre-career days, but this is really the start. These are the days that will launch your career. I would say there are two main pieces of advice that I have. So number one, like the motto has got to be, no matter what courses are offered at your school, every course can and should be an animal law course for you. It doesn't matter who's teaching it. It doesn't matter if there's an animal law component. It doesn't matter if there's zero obvious connection to animal law. There 99% of the time, if not 100% of the time, there really is. And so what do I mean by that? So when I applied to Columbia, they had, it was important to me to go to a law school that had at least one animal law course. And Columbia did, but by the time that I was a 2L, the course had been dropped, and so I was left with 0 courses. So I just decided at that point as a 2L, and this is what I would encourage everybody who's still in law school to do, I basically designed my own animal law curriculum. I started taking just any seminar that had a writing component, ideally, something where you're gonna write like a term paper that you can spend a good amount of time on, and I made it an animal law course. So I'm gonna give you guys, I like went back in the archives, looked through my CLS email, because I really wanted to give you guys practical examples and ideas. So first example, I took a mass incarceration clinic. On its face, nothing to do with animal law. I'll give you guys the name of the course and the name of what I wrote my term paper on for each one. So mass incarceration clinic, I wrote a paper called Advocacy Group Funded Government Prosecutors, an analysis of the ALDF's financing of an animal cruelty deputy district attorney. It was a great experience. This is sort of another common theme through everything I'll go through today, is when you are a law student, it's like when you've just moved to a new city and you have this like small window where you can just talk to anybody, say anything, like anybody you go to, you can just be like, oh, I'm new here, and you can sound like a fool. It doesn't matter. You just have this like window and you have to really exploit it. So in that mass incarceration clinic, writing that paper, it gave me an excuse to reach out to the ALDF. They let me interview the district attorney, Justin Marceau, who is, I think, in here in the room today. I reached out with him, to him. There was a few papers that I was citing, and I said, oh, can I have the sources for them? We emailed back and forth. There's so much that you can do with a course like a mass incarceration clinic that has nothing on its face to do with animal law. Another example, I took a class called Science in the Courts. It was taught by a retired judge. So my paper there was called The Evolving Legal Status of Children and What It Can Teach Us About Judicial Treatment of Animals. So it turned out, this popped up in one of the readings, I think, in the course, that early on in the child's rights movement, there were actually a lot of parallels between how children were treated under the law and how animals are treated under the law. So that was my in there. Mental health law was another seminar I took. In that course, my paper was called An Analysis of a New Application of the Parents' Patriae Power, Advancing Legal Protections for Animals. For background, that's the power that's invoked when the state institutionalizes somebody. So I thought, okay, how can we use that as a potential application in the animal law world? Next, oh gosh, yeah, there was a course called Law and Philosophy. That was a little bit more straightforward. There I wrote about the ethics and legality of zookeeping. Really interesting paper to research. And I have to say, with all of these courses, I found, I'll be honest, I think actually there was one course where I felt the professor maybe was a little bit like, why? But for the most part, it was, wow, great, these are new exciting things. It's actually really a way to, I don't want to say educate professors, but for professors who don't think about animal issues, it can be a really interesting way to let them know that the topic they're teaching actually intersects with animal welfare as well. And then the last thing I'll say on that is journals are also another really great way. So I was on a journal called Journal of Law and Social Problems, and I wrote my note about Bella's bill, which was a bill that would have moved New York's animal abuse and neglect laws from this very archaic section of the law that they're under called Ag and Markets, and would move them to the penal code. Another really great opportunity as an in, just to cold call people, to email people. I, at that point, had a contracts professor who was my supervisor for my note. He was very upfront. I don't have any background in this. Is there somebody else who you can get as sort of an unofficial mentor? And so I was able to reach out to Marianne Sullivan, who had previously taught the animal law course at Columbia, and she was sort of an unofficial mentor or an unofficial supervisor for the note. And again, actually, the ALDF was really helpful. I don't remember, it was probably Tom. Tom Linney, I've just bugged this man so much for years. I think I wrote him and I said, you know, is there somebody I can talk to? He ended up putting me in touch with the ALDF's senior legislative affairs manager for New York. And of course, you know, hi, I'm writing this paper, can we chat? And, you know, we're not gonna sit down and have like a coffee. This is legislative affairs director. So we meet up at a foie gras ban protest, and we're standing there like with our signs. It was actually like horse-drawn carriages too. So we're like, ban foie gras. And then I'm like, so listen, Bella's bill, and taking my notes, and she gave me all the tea, and it was great. Got to cite her in my paper. So yeah, those are some examples of ways that you can make every course an animal law course. I would say the second thing is to really think about how you can get to know people in the field. Like Hira was saying, it's a growing field, and where the movement is it's expanding every day, but it is still a relatively small world, and you can, obviously you guys are here already, so that's half of the advice that I have to give, but put yourself in spaces where you're gonna meet people who will be your future colleagues and stuff. I would say that this also, and I'll talk about this a little bit separately when we talk more about later on when you become an associate, but I would say this same theme carries on when you move to a firm, if you go that route. One story that comes to mind, there was an assignment that I had, I think this was maybe like second or third year. I was working on an assignment with this new partner, and so I said, oh yeah, you know, let's go get a coffee. So we have a coffee at the cafe in the office, and I like don't know how to have a conversation with somebody and it not at some point involve animals. So of course I'm like saying something animal related, and he said, oh yeah, you know, I love animals. I go every year to the Humane Society Gala. I love it, you know, event of the year, blah blah. I said, okay. Like, as the Gen Z kids would say, oh, bet, okay. You know, and I'm like, bet. So, and this was, I don't know, let's just say this was like January, the gala is in October. I'm like, okay. So I'm like, you know, we talk about the assignment. I think I worked for him for like maybe a month. It was pretty short term. Go home, look up Humane Society Gala. It's like, oh, October 15th. I'm like, okay. So I put in my calendar, we have at the firm like a weekly happy hour for the litigation. So I look, okay, it's on the 15th, it's on a Saturday, let's say, the happy hour is on Thursday, and put that in my calendar. So like 6 months later, Thursday comes, I go to the happy hour, I see him across the room, I'm already like making my way. I'm like, hey, you know, my guy, I haven't seen him in like a while, I haven't worked for him for like 6 months. So I'm like, what you doing this weekend? And he's like, I'm going to the Humane Society Gala. What are you doing? I was like, well, I'm gonna be your +1 if you'll have me, you know? He's like, okay, let me like make some calls, I'll see. 48 hours later, I'm with Chris Green, we're drinking champagne at the gala. I'm hearing amazing people talk about their work, I'm meeting more people. Those types of, just have it in the back of your mind all the time. And you're gonna have months, I've had months, I try to have as few months as possible where I'm not doing any animal law pro bono work. And even in those months or days, just like constantly have it in the back of your mind. This is not like a two-step process if you go to a firm where it's like, oh, now are my, like these are my firm days, and then later I'm gonna become an animal lawyer. It's like, it's really gotta be on your mind all the time. I think that's really the advice that I would give for law students, yeah.
I'd love to, you touched a bit on your incredible networking skills and also how it's not a two-step process. And so I'm curious if you do have advice for junior associates on kind of how to work that hierarchy in wanting to take on animal law pro bono work.
Yes, I do. So, okay, big picture, I think, to always keep in mind, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is when a firm is allowing an associate to do pro bono work, it's really a big deal. It's a very like serious and real financial commitment that they're making. If you bill 500 hours on a billable case, that's 500 hours worth of time that the firm is going to make in money. And if you spend 500 hours on a pro bono case, that's 500 hours worth of time that like the firm is not realizing. So first of all, I would say it's really an investment that they're making, and it's something to be really grateful for and to take very seriously. But in terms of sort of the, let me say like the ecosystem of pro bono work, there are sort of three players. So obviously number one, there's the client or the prospective client. In my experience, that's always been an animal welfare organization. I just haven't personally done any work on behalf of individuals. And I do think, I can only speak for my experience at my firm, but I get the impression at most firms it tends to be easier to do pro bono work on behalf of an organization rather than an individual client. But so yeah, that's player one is the client. Player number two is gonna be you as an associate, and so what are you looking to get out of it? What are you looking to accomplish? And then the third player is the firm itself, right? So if you ask yourself, and always be keeping this in mind, I would say, you know, what is each party's interest? So for the client, the way I like to think about it, I don't know if any of you guys have seen this film, The Intern. It's like Anne Hathaway, and she is like this like fashion business woman, and then she hires this like senior citizen intern, Robert De Niro, and he's kind of sitting around the office all day and like doesn't know what to do, and nobody's taking him seriously. And there's this desk in the office where everybody kind of like dumps their stuff that has to get done, like they dump their papers and whatever, and it builds up, and it's this big eyesore, and you know he has no assignment, so he's just sitting there. And one day he's like, okay, let me come in early, and he cleans up the desk, and you know obviously Anne Hathaway arrives, and she's like, oh my God, who did this? And you know. And so that's sort of how I think about the role that you as an associate doing pro bono work can have in the field. So think to yourself, like, what is something that this client maybe knows they need to, like, they want to look into, or they want to potentially pursue this case, or they, you know, they want to like, you know, have somebody write up a memo, but they just don't have the time. And that might be a really perfect place for you to step in. And we've spoken about this, others have mentioned this already throughout the conference and on this panel, that the movement is really, there's so much room to do work in the movement that's not just the obvious stuff. And the way I like to think about it is like the movement is like a hospital, like whether you are the nurse, like hands-on treating a patient, or you're an admin, or you're the janitor, like you're all contributing. And so don't limit yourself just to the sort of more obvious cases. It may very well be that if you decide to become a tax associate, you can help, I don't know what they do, for a 401c3. It's like, you know, you do what you do, yeah, you know, you help in the ways you can help. Maybe it's real estate law, and you can help that way if let's say an organization needs to buy a building, whatever it might be. So consider the non-obvious sources. Then the second player obviously is you as the associate. I think the big things here are like, what skills do you want to exercise? I've had times where, more so as a junior, where it was like, okay, I've just come off of doing a ton of doc review. I really want to write, and so I'm gonna try to find an amicus brief that I can write. And the other situation, though, that I've also had is where I think, okay, there's a skill I really want to improve on, so let me find a pro bono case where I can get a supervisor who's really, really good at that skill. Like, there was a time I really wanted to work on my writing, and so I found an associate, maybe like a 10th, 11th year associate in the appellate group. I mean, these are like the best writers, I think, in the world. They're so good, and so let me find, him to supervise me and do something writing-wise. And then the third player is gonna be the firm, obviously, and their interests are also very important to keep in mind. I would say firms' interests are usually going to be attorney development. They're letting you do this work because they're getting something out of it, in the sense that they're going to hopefully have at the end of your assignment a better associate, right? So you want to think about taking on cases that will allow you to exercise a number of skills. Like, if you have the opportunity to see a litigation through, from drafting a complaint to doing discovery to stand-up speaking roles to going to trial, like, that's going to be really, really valuable. Number two, people always sleep on this, but the PR, like, you have to reach out to the PR teams at your firms when you do pro bono work and ask them, like, do we want to put this on the LinkedIn page, or do we want to put this on our site? Make sure that they get that out of it. And then, and in terms of the PR thing, I would also say maximize the opportunity. So it might be that you win a partial motion for summary judgment, and you can get PR involved at that point. And then at the end, when the case wraps up, you can get them involved at that point. I mentioned the case for PETA, so at that point we started out with 2 airports, and when one of them settled, we put out a little article about that. Later, when the other one, when we went on that, we put out another little article on that. And then I would say the only other thing I would say about considering things from a firm's perspective is, I think it's usually better to have, there's definitely a role for having smaller, more discrete projects, but oftentimes I think it's better to have one big project where, like I said, you can exercise a lot of skills than to have a bunch of smaller, more repetitive assignments, and so that's something to keep in mind. And then lastly, don't be intimidated by the process of bringing on a new client. There is going to be paperwork, there's memos, there's clearing conflicts, all of that, but it tends to be doable in my experience, obviously. I have brought on new clients to the firm, animal welfare organizations, and so it's possible. And I would also say, on that point, it's good to have a good reputation for being reasonable. Know your firm's clients. Don't request to do pro bono work on something that's going to be directly contrary to the interests of a client. You want to reach out less often and have your requests approved than to constantly be being told no. Any other tips that I have? I think that's really it, yeah. Anybody who wants to reach out to me, by the way, find me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to chat about these things because I find it really exciting, especially when you reach sort of the end of a case and you get to look back and think like, oh, that was essentially fill in the blank number of dollars donation that I was able to make. And so it's really, really fulfilling working as an associate in the pro bono field, yeah.
Great, thank you. I feel like I have like a behind the scenes look. So I think we have time for a couple of questions. If we have 2 mics right here, if you want to line up at the mics.
Hi, my name is Barbie. I go to Georgetown. I'm a 2L. So because I do go to Georgetown, I live in DC, and I'm very disappointed by how expensive the vegan food is in DC. And like, not only is it very expensive, but the places that are not expensive are closing down. So I was just like wondering, what exactly should you say to someone who expresses this despair and like, that it's too expensive? I always mention that the staples are actually not that expensive, but in the back of my head, I know that like learning how to cook tofu takes time, which is just another resource and like mental labor. And so it is expensive, right? At the end of the day, even if the tofu itself is not expensive. And like this kind of brings up, how do I make tofu like sound delicious, right? Like how do I tell them these things? So I guess I'm just wondering, right, like as part of the CELDIF chapter, I talk to a lot of people who like are interested in it, but they are expressing these concerns, and sometimes I feel kind of like, when you said it's like, yeah, it does suck, bye, like, but I don't want to do that, so I don't know, any help on that?
I guess I could take that.
I feel like this is right up your alley, Ilana, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, one thing to kind of just state is that because of the subsidy structure in this country, as many of us know, unfortunately, conventional animal products are cheaper because our government is subsidizing those products to be cheaper. They shouldn't be, and so that's obviously like a big, federal fight that others are taking on that I'm very appreciative of. But like you said, talking about the staple products that actually are cheaper, and maybe giving very simple ways to cook tofu. Like we make 5 blocks every week, just put them on a pan, press them, cut them up, throw them in the oven, bake them, and then make a really delicious sauce. And being able to describe that, like, hey, yes, it does take some time up front, but once you're able to cook that, throwing it in the freezer and then taking it out, it makes it squishy, yeah, all those different things, that you can kind of talk about in simple terms. I wish I had a better answer for like why restaurant food is so expensive. I also think people will pick certain places and be like, oh, this is really expensive. It's like, yeah, but there's also other really expensive food that isn't vegan, and so they'll kind of pick that out. And so that's also something is like, are you holding your plant-based products to the same standards that you're holding all of those other, food standards to, is something that I'll point out. But, even having food that, I don't know if you're like tabling, but having really delicious, easy food to cook that's available for people to try and be like, oh, this is super simple. You just buy these few ingredients and make the sauces you've always been making, but instead use beans or lentils, tofu, things like that would be my suggestion. But I hear you, and I wish we could like fix the problem of making everything cheaper, but when it comes to like the plant-based products like Beyond Impossible, things like that, obviously, I know it is a challenge.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And this isn't a full like catch-all cure, but Falafel Inc. in DC, I had it for the first time in June. If you want to eat vegan shawarma for the rest of your life for very few dollars, highly recommend that. It was so good. I dream about it. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia Villamagna. I'm a 2L at Chicago Kent. My question is maybe for a few members of the panel, so feel free to jump in, whoever. So I am in the process of writing a law review journal student note, and I really like the advice of reaching out to maybe professors or other stakeholders that might not necessarily be at your school to also help you with some of your research. And so maybe also from a professor's perspective and then a student's perspective that has written a law review note, what are some of the strategies of finding those people and approaching those people so that myself and the professor or whoever I reach out is getting something out of the relationship?
Yeah, can I? Okay. Yeah, so I think that it really depends on how emailing I think is a good idea always, and I think it depends on how you make the ask, or in my experience and the professors, the animal law professors I know who are in the room, I would say 99.9% of the time would be more than happy to chat with you. It's not just about talking to students at their universities. It's like every animal law professor wants to engage more students, and like scholarship gets us really excited. So we really, really want student work to be published and be out there. So it's just like being, and these tips aren't anything rocket science or groundbreaking, but like be respectful of their time. If like obviously in your email, tell them what you're writing about, what kind of help you're seeking. Are you seeking resources? Do you just want to bounce your argument off them? If you have a draft that you can share with them, that would always be super helpful, because just reading your argument is easier than just, again, it depends on what stage in the writing process you are. If it's early stage, that's totally fine as well, but just be really clear about what you want from them. And I think for professors, like, they're not really looking for anything from you except for like genuine engagement with the law. And it's not that you need to have all the answers or you need to get everything perfectly right, but just be willing to learn and be open to it. If you set up a meeting with them, don't be late, don't be a no-show, like those basic things. But yeah, I think most professors would be more than happy to help. And how to find professors, like I said, a lot of them are in the room today, but the Animal Law Conference has historically featured a lot of animal law professors. So like just like going to the Animal Law Conference's website and looking up who's spoken in the past and going to different universities like Lewis and Clark or Vermont or Harvard, like, universities that offer full-fledged animal law programs, just looking at who their professors are who are teaching. And also like look at what the professor's expertise is. So a lot of times if you reach out to a professor who specializes in like industrial ag law, and you ask them about like a wildlife law issue, they might redirect you to someone else, which is also fine. But like if you can reach out to the wildlife law professor from the get-go, it saves everyone time. So just those tips.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think too, as Hira mentioned, reaching out to if you don't know a professor at your school, feel free to reach out to any of us. The reason I was eating copious amounts of vegan shawarma in DC a few months ago is because I was at a professor's workshop for animal law professors, and we likely know someone that is at your school who may teach torts, and you may have no idea that they have this special interest in animal law, but we do, and we can make that connection.
And one fast thing I would add on that too is always look at the sources of like any paper or book that you're reading. The sources are basically going to be a list of other people who have written on that topic.
Yeah, that's a great point. We are actually at time, but our panelists will be here during our break for more questions. I just want to say thank you to Allison, Ilana, Hira, and Tené for taking time with us today.